Hello and welcome to the John Rylands Research Institute and Library here in Manchester. I'm Jeanette Martin, I'm the Modern History Archivist and I'm also the curator of our most recent exhibition, which is Manchester's Guardian, 200 Years of the Guardian newspaper. So you're joining us on what is a very historical moment. Today marks exactly 200 years since the first edition of the Guardian newspaper, formerly the Manchester Guardian newspaper. And I'm speaking to you today from the John Rylands Library, a gorgeous neo-Gothic library here in the heart of Manchester. So the library holds the archive of the Manchester Guardian, which was gifted to the university in 1971, and that was right at the part of time when the Guardian was closing its operations in Manchester and moving its production to London. So to mark today's anniversary, I've picked out 4 objects from our collections, and each of them speaks to the theme of anniversaries and how we mark them, what we collect and what we remember. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the first edition of the Manchester Guardian. The first weekly edition of the Manchester Guardian appeared on Saturday the 5th of May 1821. It was not until 1836, when the newspaper's stamp duty was reduced, that the Manchester Guardian became a twice-weekly newspaper. In 1855, when the paper tax was abolished, the Guardian became a daily, and that status it retains to this very day. I have here a recently donated first edition, which as you can see is getting a little ragged around the edges. This copy survived the last 200 years precisely because it was the first edition and therefore significant. We always like to collect the first and the last of things. I also have at the side a facsimile copy of the first edition that appeared in a centenary supplement issued by the Manchester Guardian on the 5th of May 1921, so 100 years ago. And also they included in that publication a history of the first 100 years. Now if you look at the top left-hand corner, you can see the opening words of this legendary newspaper is a notice of a lost dog, a black Newfoundland bitch. Hardly an auspicious start for an organ that would one day be recognised on the world stage. You can see that the front page back in 1821 was not very attractive. Column after column of densely packed type, with only a sprinkling of woodcut illustrations to break up the monotony of the columns. Photographs had yet to be invented, and the first page is devoted entirely to advertisements and notices. It was not until September 1952 that the Manchester Guardian finally ditched the adverts and shifted to the more modern practice of news and headlines on the front page. In May 100 years ago, the Cross Street offices of the Manchester Guardian were bustling with activity. It was the newspaper's bicentenary, and a flurry of events and commemorations were planned, from special editions and dinners to gifts for C.P. Scott, the much-loved editor of the Manchester Guardian. Our next object is a very special photographic album. I'm going to walk across here. This beautifully bound copy was presented to C.P. Scott by his staff to celebrate the centenary. I should also mention that 1921 was a double anniversary. It marked not only 100 years of the Guardian, but also the year when the legendary C.P. Scott reached his 50th year of editorship. Scott was synonymous with the Manchester Guardian, and it was under his direction that the paper transformed from a provincial newspaper to a global phenomenon. So I'm going to very carefully open up the album for you. And we have to go quite slowly as we look at the album because it's 100 years old and it's quite delicate and fragile. So the album includes a series of group photographs, department by department, of the entire staff of the newspaper. So you can see here we've got London advertising. Everybody was in this photo album, from the editor and the sub-reporters to cooks, porters, errand boys and cleaners. And what's really, really nice is that each of the employees got a photograph of their own particular division. And I often wonder how many of these albums are stashed away in people's houses with other family heirlooms. So if you listen to this from Manchester and you've got one of them in your attic, do get in touch. Now we think that these photographs were taken by The Guardian's first staff photographer, who was called Walter Doughty. I'm going to fast forward as fast as I can, while being careful, to a photograph that shows you what Walter looks like. So Walter did a very long stint at The Guardian. He was there from 1908 to 1949. And here we are, we found Walter. So you can spot him, he's the gentleman on the back holding the camera. And to us, it looks terribly outdated, but back in 1921, that camera was probably state of the art. And really, that's one of the things that I find most fascinating about this album, the way it captures times and how they've changed, whether you're looking at the fashion that people are wearing, or you're looking at the job descriptions and the kind of techniques that we no longer have in newspaper production. But what I really want to show you is, unfortunately, right at the back of the album. So I'm going to have to carefully show you. So we've got electricians, we've got typecasting and linear type. You see, a lot of these processes won't mean very much to modern audiences. The Watchmen, I really like the Watchmen, don't they look lovely? And we're getting warm now. Night Messengers, the returns room. Right, this is a picture I really wanted to show you. So I've talked about how life has changed since the 1920s. If you look at the legend on this photograph, it says stables, motor drivers, etc. So we know back in 1921, The Guardian employed men to look after the horses and carts which delivered bundles of newspapers to shops around Manchester and then to the newspaper trains. Back then, there were certainly no digital subscriptions, and if the train broke down, the London subscribers would not be reading the Manchester Guardian with their breakfast cuppa. So this photo to me is really interesting because it's at the cusp of when horsepower was being replaced by machines. So I'm going to very, very carefully close this album because I don't want it open any longer than it needs to be. Now we're going to fast forward to August 1959, and that summer there was a chorus of disapproval when The Guardian dropped the word Manchester from its title. For many years, most of the sales had been outside of the city, and The Guardian had outgrown its Manchester home. But as news of the name change spread, the Manchester Guardian offices on Cross Street received a barrage of correspondence. Some of them were congratulatory, but many, many more were lamenting the loss of the word Manchester from the masthead. So if we look over here, we have a letter from P.H. Hamer in Cape Town. We know very little about Mr. Hamer, other than he was an exiled Mancunian living in Cape Town. He describes in the letter how proud he is to be a Manchester man, and understands that the readership of his favourite newspaper is far wider than Northern England. I mean, the fact that he's writing himself from Cape Town certainly indicates that. He understands that Manchester's newspaper belongs not just to Manchester but the whole world. But this does not stop his sorrow at the loss of the word Manchester. He then goes on to list what the city means to him, from Peterloo to the university. And the last paragraph in particular poetically recalls the sights and sounds of the city. The throb of your presses, painted barges on the canal next to Whitworth Street, bales dropping from a height next to a nonchalant man on a lorry, the skyline of buildings by moonlight in a blackout, ocean-going ships far from the sea, and the Manchester Guardian. Now, he most certainly sent this letter with an audience in mind. And if you look at the cheeky postscript, he's angling for his letter to be printed. Should you be publishing this letter, be kind enough to send me a copy. And what I think it would be absolutely fascinating if P.H. Hamer could have known that on the bicentenary we would in effect be publishing his letter for him. So I want to move on now to our very final object. And this provokes a question: why do we keep things? And in particular, why do we keep the first and the last? This intriguing item only arrived at the library about 2 weeks ago. It was donated to us by a Rochdale lady called Joan Stock, who was a sub-editor at The Guardian, and she bequeathed it in her will. It had been kept wrapped in cardboard and safely stored under her bed for decades. Joan's metal plate commemorates the last edition of The Guardian printed in Manchester, and the date reads the 28th of August 1976. In a handwritten note that accompanied the gift, Joan described it as a flong. In relief printing, a flong, it's a great word, isn't it? A flong is a temporary negative mould created to cast a metal stereotype, which can then be used in a rotary press. This process is called stereotyping. Strictly speaking, flongs are made of paper mache and are negative rather than positive. Perhaps instead this is a stereotyping plate, but I'm not quite sure. So if you are a former printer or knowledgeable about the hot metal processes and you just happen to be watching this live stream, I'd love to hear from you and learn more about this object. But regardless of terminology, this piece of newspaper history harks back to a day when newspapers were printed using hot metal technology. By the 1980s, hot metal was dying out. It was complex, required highly skilled labour, and as new technologies emerged, it became comparatively more expensive and inefficient. The end of hot metal printing at The Guardian followed the Wapping dispute in 1986, when Rupert Murdoch shut down News International's print operation and moved to a new plant in the east of London overnight. Not only was the technology of newspaper production very different in the 1970s, but back then The Guardian was only 10 pence a copy. And that really ends the historical jaunt through time and place, and we arrive now in 2021 to what is happening at the John Rylands Library, Deansgate. So if you've enjoyed this live stream and want to find out more, our exhibition, Manchester's Guardian, 200 Years of the Guardian newspaper, is now live. And later this summer, when we reopen, you'll be able to visit the physical exhibition in person. Please keep checking our website for details of our opening. The exhibition itself picks out key moments in the newspaper's long history, from principled opposition to the Boer War and active involvement in various humanitarian causes, to reports on Nazi Germany, and more recently, The Guardian's role in breaking the story of Edward Snowden. The exhibition also highlights the legacy of C.P. Scott and the national and global reach of the Manchester Guardian. Now, I do hope that by showing you some of the objects out of our collections, I've whetted your appetite, and if you would like to come to the library and use the Manchester Guardian for research or just general interest, it's possible to book an appointment in the reading room. Again, you will find full details on how to do this on our website. So I want to thank you all very much for watching this live stream. And now I think it's time for me to settle down with a cup of coffee and the latest edition of The Guardian. Now, today's edition might just have something special in there. And of course, when I bought it this morning, I was very delighted to see what is now our third copy of the very first edition, so we shall add this facsimile to our collection here at the John Rylands Library. So thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you all, and I do hope you'll visit us when we're open.